They said power belongs to those who sit at the top. But what happens when the man who saves $1 billion empire is the same man she laughed at in front of everyone? Tonight, a system worth billions is collapsing. Dozens of the country's top engineers stand useless. A cold, ruthless billionaire CEO is seconds away from signing an order that could trigger catastrophe. And in the shadows of the control room, a quiet man in a gray uniform steps forward, not for glory, not for revenge, just because he's the only one who actually knows how to stop it. Drop a comment with your city. Let me see how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end, because nothing about this man is what you expect. The boiler room on sub-level 3 smelled like rust and burnt copper wire, the kind of smell that gets into your clothes and never fully leaves. Ethan Cole had stopped noticing it months ago. He crouched behind a coolant pipe the diameter of a grown man's torso, flashlight clenched between his teeth, left hand pressing a thermal sensor against a junction box that had been rattling since Tuesday. The rattle meant something. To most people on this floor, it meant nothing. To Ethan, it meant the secondary pressure valve on line 7 was developing microfractures along the weld seam, which meant if nobody caught it before the winter load test next month, they were looking at a controlled shutdown that would cost the company 48 hours of production minimum. He wrote it in his maintenance log in precise, almost clinical shorthand. He didn't explain the diagnosis. He never did. His log said what needed to be fixed and when. Nobody on this floor had ever asked him why he knew the things he knew. That was fine. That was the point. It was 2:17 in the morning. The rest of the building, Hartwell Technologies, 43 floors of glass and ambition and money, was quiet except for the skeleton night crew and the distant hum of servers on floors 12 through 16. Ethan worked nights by choice, not because the pay was slightly better, though it was, not because the supervisors left him alone, though they did. He worked nights because nights meant he could be home by 7 in the morning, make breakfast, walk his daughter to the school bus, and still catch 3 hours of sleep before she came back at 3:15. That schedule was the architecture of his entire life. Everything else was built around it. He finished the inspection, sealed the junction box, and stood up slowly. His knees complained. He was 32 years old, and his knees already complained like a man 20 years older. A souvenir from years of crawling through military infrastructure in places that didn't appear on public maps. He ignored the complaint the way he ignored most things and made his way back down the corridor toward the service elevator. His phone buzzed. One message from the contact labeled simply, Mia's school. He opened it before he even reached the elevator. Hi, Mr. Cole. Just a reminder that Mia's class picture is this Friday. Students are asked to wear something that makes them feel like themselves. Just wanted to make sure you got the earlier notice. He stopped walking, read it twice. Class picture Friday. He pulled up his mental calendar, the real one, the one he kept in his head because writing things down felt like admitting he was barely holding the schedule together, and confirmed what he already knew. Friday he was covering Martinez's shift because Martinez had a court date, which meant he wouldn't be home until 8:30, which meant Mia would have to pick her own outfit, which was fine. She was 7. She had opinions about everything, including her outfits. Last week she had worn a yellow rain jacket over a purple dress because, in her words, it's called layering, Dad. It's a thing. He typed back a short reply thanking the teacher. Then he stood in the hallway for a moment longer than necessary, holding the phone, thinking about Friday. He put the phone away and kept walking. The elevator opened on the ground floor service corridor at 2:31 a.m. Ethan logged his completed inspection rounds at the security desk. A board guard named Philip, who acknowledged him with a chin lift and went back to his phone, and headed toward the break room on the east side of the building. Not because he wanted coffee, because he'd left his secondary toolkit in the cabinet there 2 nights ago and kept forgetting to retrieve it. The break room was empty. One of the overhead fluorescent strips was flickering, which it had been doing for 11 days. He'd submitted the work order. It was still pending. He reached above the cabinet, retrieved his kit, and was about to leave when he heard voices in the corridor outside. Not unusual at this hour. Security did rounds. Facilities management sometimes ran late audits. But these voices were moving fast and low, the specific cadence of people trying not to be overheard while also being too agitated to fully control their volume. He stood still. Can't push the timeline. We don't have authorization. We have implied authorization. She wants it done before the federal inspection. Implied isn't you want to be the one who tells her it's not ready. You want to walk into that boardroom and say implied isn't good enough? A pause. The sound of footsteps slowing near the break room door. Ethan didn't move. He wasn't hiding exactly. He was just very still, in the way that people who have spent years in situations where stillness mattered tend to be still. Fine. Thursday. But if the grid diagnostic flags anything during the handoff, that's on you. Nothing's going to flag. We buried it deep enough. The footsteps moved on. The voices faded down the corridor. Ethan stood in the flickering break room for a long moment. Then he picked up his toolkit and left. Buried it deep enough. He filed that sentence in the back of his mind the way he filed most things that didn't immediately require action, carefully, in a place he could find it again. He drove home through the pre-dawn dark in a 12-year-old Civic that had 190,000 miles on it and a heating system that worked on its own schedule. Tonight the heat worked fine, which he considered a small mercy. He drove through the industrial outskirts of Boston, past the auto salvage yards and the closed-down textile warehouses and the 24-hour laundromats, and turned into the neighborhood where he and Mia lived. It wasn't a bad neighborhood. It was just honest. The houses were small and close together, and the yards were the size of parking spaces. Mrs. Papadopoulos next door had a garden that was her entire personality. The Garcias across the street had a dog that barked at clouds. The streetlight in front of Ethan's house had been out for 3 weeks. He pulled into the driveway, cut the engine, sat for a moment in the quiet. The house was dark except for the small lamp he always left on in the living room. Not because he was afraid of the dark, but because coming home to a fully dark house felt wrong in a way he couldn't exactly explain and had stopped trying to. He went in through the side door, hung his jacket, pulled off his work boots. The house smelled like the lavender dryer sheets Mia had insisted on buying because she saw them in a commercial and decided they were necessary. He went upstairs, opened her door an inch. She was asleep on her stomach, one arm hanging off the edge of the mattress, hair everywhere. A stuffed elephant named Gerald was wedged under her chin. He watched her breathe for a few seconds. Just that, just the simple fact of her chest rising and falling, and then he pulled the door back to where it had been. In the hallway, a framed photograph hung crooked on the wall. It always hung crooked. He straightened it every morning, and somehow it always went crooked again. It was a picture of the three of them, him, Mia, and Sarah, taken at a beach in Maine 2 summers before the accident. Sarah was laughing at something off camera, her hair blowing sideways, one hand on Mia's shoulder. Ethan was looking at Sarah instead of the camera. He straightened the photograph. Then he went downstairs, made himself a cup of tea he wouldn't finish, and sat at the kitchen table with his maintenance log open in front of him. Microfractures, line 7 junction, recommend inspection within 14 days. He stared at the entry for a while. Then, below it, he wrote 2 other words he didn't include in the official log. Buried deep. He slept 4 hours and woke up when he always woke up, 5 minutes before his alarm, the way his body had done since the years when sleeping past your alarm in certain situations meant something considerably worse than being late. He made eggs. He burned the toast slightly, which was the only way Mia would eat it. She came downstairs at 6:52 in a green sweater and the rain jacket, no dress underneath this time. "It's not raining," he said. "I know," she said, sitting down and pulling the plate toward her. "I just like it." "Fair enough." She ate. He drank his coffee and watched her process the morning. She was not a fast start person, which she had not inherited from him. And somewhere between the second and third bite of toast, she said, without looking up, "Are you going to be here for the parent lunch on the 14th? He pulled up the mental calendar again. The 14th was a Thursday. Regular shift, no coverage issues. "Yeah," he said. "I'll be there." She nodded, still not looking up, just filed it away. "Good," she said. That single word carried more weight than she probably knew. He was back at Hartwell Technologies by 9:30 that morning. Not for his shift, which didn't start until 11, but because he needed to replace a relay switch in the third-floor server room before the day crew's morning maintenance window closed at 10. The building was alive in the daytime in a way it never was at night. People in expensive clothes moved with expensive urgency through the glass corridors. Screens everywhere showed graphs and projections. The lobby had a waterfall feature that cost more than Ethan made in 6 months. He badged through the service entrance, collected his toolbox from the maintenance locker, and took the service stairs. The third-floor server room was a long, narrow space, cold enough to make your breath visible, lit in blue-white LED strips. He found the relay panel, opened his kit, and was midway through the replacement, a 15-minute job at most, when the main corridor outside the server room erupted in sound. Not alarm sound, people sound. The particular quality of a crowd partying. He kept working. The server room door swung open. 2 men in suits he didn't recognize entered first, scanning the room the way security personnel scan rooms, though they were dressed like executives. Then 2 more. Then a woman. She walked like the room had been waiting for her before she arrived. She was maybe 30, sharp-featured, dark hair pulled back in a way that looked effortless and almost certainly wasn't. She wore a charcoal jacket over a dark blouse, no visible jewelry except one thin watch, and she moved through the server room with the focused disinterest of someone conducting an inspection they already know the result of. Isabella Hartwell. Ethan had seen her face on the company intranet, on the building lobby screens. He had never seen her in person. She stopped near the far end of the room, where the primary cooling units ran, and began asking one of her executives questions in a low, clipped voice. The executive answered quickly. She didn't nod. She just waited until he was done and asked another question. Ethan finished tightening the relay housing. He closed the panel, packed his tools, and stood. One of the flanking executives, young guy, wire-rimmed glasses, the look of someone who had learned to anticipate moods professionally, noticed him and stiffened slightly. The way people stiffen when they see something they're not sure should be there. "What are you doing in here?" the executive asked. Not hostile exactly, just the automatic ranking of the room. "Relay replacement," Ethan said. He held up the old component, a small metal piece scorched at one contact point. This one was pulling about 12% over rated current, swapped it out. The executive looked at the piece, said nothing. Isabella Hartwell had not looked over. She was still in conversation with the other exec, pointing at something on a tablet screen. "This area is supposed to be cleared during executive walkthroughs," the Wireglasses exec said. "I know," Ethan said. "The window was closing. If I didn't do it this morning, it was going to be a week before the next maintenance slot." The exec opened his mouth, closed it. The calculus of that, is this worth the disruption of addressing it, played visibly across his face. It was at that moment that Isabella Hartwell turned around. She looked at Ethan the way you look at furniture that has appeared in an inconvenient location. Not quite irritated, not quite anything, just assessing. "Is there a problem?" she said. Not to Ethan, to the exec. "No, ma'am. Maintenance." She looked at Ethan for one more second. Then she said, clearly, in a tone that wasn't especially cruel, just utterly, casually dismissive, "Make sure the repairmen aren't scheduled during walkthroughs going forward. This isn't the kind of impression we want to create for the Federal Review." She said repairmen the way you say furniture. Not with contempt, with absence. Like the word required no further qualification. Then she turned back to the tablet. 2 of the other executives in the room glanced at each other with the brief, practiced smirk of people who have learned that finding the boss's dismissals amusing is a useful survival strategy. Ethan picked up his toolbox. He was almost to the door when she spoke again. Not to him, to the room, but loudly enough that it was clearly meant to carry. Someone who knows nothing about what actually runs this building, handing us a relay piece like it's a trophy. That's what passes for skilled labor these days. There was quiet laughter. Muted, professional, but real. Ethan stopped walking for exactly 1 second. 1. He could feel the old reflex set, the one that had nothing to do with being a maintenance technician, flicker somewhere in his chest and then go still. He kept walking. Outside in the corridor, he set his toolbox down briefly and rolled his right shoulder. Then he picked it up and headed for the service stairs. The thing about people who talk to you like you're not entirely real. In his experience, they were usually the people most frightened of the parts of the world they didn't understand, the parts that actually kept things running, the parts they'd never learned to see. He didn't think about Isabella Hartwell after that. He had a shift starting in 90 minutes and a lunch to pack before then. That night, the building was quiet by midnight. The day crew was long gone. The skeleton night staff, Philip at the security desk, two other maintenance workers covering different floors, an IT on-call tech sleeping in the break room with his shoes on, moved through their routines without ceremony. Ethan was on the 6th floor checking HVAC duct seals when the first alarm sounded. Not a fire alarm, not a standard fault alert. This was the deep, resonant tone of the energy management system, the one that lived in the bones of the building, tied directly to the core power infrastructure that ran Hartwell Technologies' flagship project, the Helios Grid Integration Unit, a proprietary energy routing system that was the centerpiece of the company's $40 billion government contract, the thing they'd been building toward for 3 years, the thing that was supposed to demonstrate in front of a federal review panel that Hartwell Technologies could run sustainable energy infrastructure for a network of national defense facilities. Ethan went still. The tone meant the Helios primary diagnostic had failed. He was already moving toward the service stairs before the building intercom crackled to life with the on-call engineer's voice, tight, too fast, the specific sound of someone trying to stay calm who is not entirely succeeding. All technical staff to the Level B control center. This is not a drill. Helios primary is showing critical failure indicators. All technical staff to Level B. He took the stairs down 4 floors at a controlled run. The Level B control center was a room that most people in the building had never seen. It existed behind a keycard barrier off the main basement corridor, and it looked like what it was. The nervous system of the building's power infrastructure, walls lined with monitoring panels, a central console the size of a dining table, screens showing the real-time status of every major system in Hartwell Technologies' grid. Right now, about half of those screens were showing red. When Ethan badged through the door, he counted 9 people already in the room. 2 were engineers from the day crew who'd been pulled back in. 3 were from the on-call technical team. 1 was the facilities director, a heavyset man named Gerald Marsh who managed everything above the engineering level without, in Ethan's assessment, understanding much of what was below it. 2 were executives Ethan didn't recognize, and 1 was standing at the central console with the particular stillness of someone trying to project calm while internally recalibrating everything. Isabella Hartwell was still in the building. He registered that and moved past it. He found a position near the secondary monitoring panel on the east wall, close enough to see the full system readout, far enough back to observe without being in the center of whatever was about to unfold. And he looked at the screens. He understood what he was seeing in approximately 20 seconds. Not all of it. Not yet. But enough to know that the on-call lead engineer, a man named Torres, who was currently on the phone with what sounded like the main systems vendor, was diagnosing the wrong layer of the problem. The Helios system was showing a cascade failure across 3 primary routing nodes. Torres was treating it as a hardware fault, specifically a thermal overload on the main capacitor array, which was a reasonable first assumption given what the surface diagnostics were showing. It was also wrong. Ethan knew it was wrong because the pattern of the failure, the sequence in which the nodes had gone down, the timing between each drop, wasn't consistent with thermal overload. Thermal overload failed from the outside in. What he was looking at failed from the inside out. Specific nodes, specific timing. Something had been triggered, not broken. He looked at the screens for another 40 seconds, cross-referencing what he was seeing against what he knew about cascade failure signatures from the years before Hartwell Technologies, before Boston, before the gray uniform. Torres hung up the phone, turned to Marsh in the room. Vendor recommends we initiate a controlled system reboot, full Helios restart. They're saying we can have the system back online in 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours. One of the executives pulled out his phone immediately. Isabella Hartwell said quietly, "What does a full restart do to the federal timeline?" Marsh said, "We'd need to recertify the entire grid sequence. That's..." He looked at one of the engineers. "How long?" "Minimum 6 days," the engineer said, "probably closer to 10. The room absorbed that. The federal review was in 9 days. "There's another option," Torres said. and Ethan could hear in his voice that the man didn't fully believe what he was about to propose. We force a partial restart on the primary node cluster only. Leave the secondary and tertiary architecture intact. It's riskier. How risky? Isabella said. Torres hesitated. That hesitation was an answer. If the partial restart doesn't synchronize correctly with the secondary nodes, Ethan said from the back of the room, you'll get a voltage spike that'll take down not just Helios, but the entire building grid. You're talking about a full facility shutdown, emergency backup power only, and Helios won't just be offline. The restart surge could permanently damage the core routing architecture. You'd be looking at replacement, not repair. 18 months minimum, not 10 days. The room turned. Ethan realized he'd said it out loud before deciding to. That was slightly inconvenient. Everyone was looking at him. Torres looked confused. Marsh looked irritated in the specific way of a man whose authority has just been questioned by someone wearing a gray uniform. The executives looked uncertain. The engineers looked, this was the interesting one, like they recognized something in what he'd said and weren't sure what to do with it. Isabella Hartwell looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, with perfect, clipped precision, "You're the repairman from this morning." "I'm the maintenance technician," Ethan said. "Yes." "You're telling my lead engineer he's wrong." "I'm telling him the partial restart carries a risk that hasn't been modeled correctly." She tilted her head slightly. There was something in her expression that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite contempt. Something sharper than either, the look of someone who was genuinely, involuntarily curious and wasn't pleased about it. "And what's your modeling based on? Your experience fixing relay switches?" Someone in the room made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Ethan looked at the screens, then back at her. "I'm looking at your failure sequence," he said. Node 1 dropped at 1147. Node 3 dropped at 1149. Node 2 dropped at 1152. If this were thermal overload, 2 would have gone before 3. It runs hotter. The sequence you have is backwards for hardware failure. Something triggered this. It ran in a specific order because something told it to. Torres was quiet. Isabella was quiet. Marsh said, "That's..." and then stopped. "If you reboot into a triggered sequence," Ethan said, "you're rebooting into whatever caused this in the first place. The reboot doesn't fix it. It reactivates it." The room was very still. Isabella Hartwell stared at him for a full 4 seconds. Then she said, in a tone that was not quite a challenge and not quite anything else, "If you're so certain, then fix it." It was not an invitation. It was a dare. The kind of dare that comes with a room full of witnesses and the implicit promise that if he was wrong, there would be nothing soft about the consequences. Ethan looked at the central console, at the screens, at the cascade failure laid out in red across the monitoring panels. He set his toolbox down on the floor next to the secondary panel. "I'll need unrestricted access to the control interface," he said, "and I need everyone to stop touching the system until I say otherwise." A beat of silence. Then Isabella Hartwell said, and he would think about this moment later, not with satisfaction exactly, but with something close to it, said quietly to the room, "Give him access." He worked for 31 minutes. He didn't speak during that time. He didn't explain what he was doing in real time. He moved through the system the way he moved through everything, methodically, quietly, with the specific economy of motion that comes from years of working in environments where every action had consequences and second-guessing yourself was a luxury you didn't get. The Helios architecture was sophisticated. It was also, once you got beneath the surface layer, structured around principles he knew very well. Because some of the foundational design concepts had been adapted from infrastructure frameworks that had been developed for exactly the kind of applications that had occupied his professional life before Boston, before Mia's school bus schedule and Mrs. Papadopoulos's garden, and a 12-year-old Civic with a temperamental heater. He found the first embedded trigger at the 18-minute mark. It was buried 4 layers deep in the load-balancing subroutine, a piece of code that looked at surface level like a standard fail-safe protocol. It wasn't. It was a specifically designed cascade initiator. Someone had written it to look like part of the system's normal architecture. Someone who understood the system well enough to hide something in it convincingly. He routed around it, isolated it. established a clean pathway between the primary nodes that bypassed the compromised subroutine entirely. Then he rebuilt the synchronization handshake between the primary and secondary node clusters from the ground up, using a manual override sequence that the system technically supported, but that was buried so deep in the architecture's original documentation that most engineers who worked with Helios would never have found it. At the 31-minute mark, the red on the screens began going green. Not all at once. One node, then another. The cascade in reverse. Clean this time, stable. The system coming back online in the right sequence, the way it was supposed to. The room watched. Nobody spoke. When the final monitoring panel shifted from amber to green and the Helios status indicator in the top corner of the central screen showed operational, all systems nominal, the silence in the room was so complete that Ethan could hear the ventilation system. He stepped back from the console, his neck ached. He rolled it once, heard it crack. He turned around. Every person in that room was looking at him. Torres, the engineers, the executives, Marsh, and Isabella Hartwell. Her expression had changed. Not dramatically. She was not the kind of person whose expressions changed dramatically. He could already tell that. But something had shifted in it. The calculated composure was still there. But underneath it, something had come loose slightly. Some assumption. Some foundational thing she'd been standing on without knowing she was standing on it. "It's stable," Ethan said. "For now." "For now," she repeated. "There's something in the system that needs to come out before you run the federal review. What I found was one piece. I'd want to do a full audit before I'd call it clean." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, "Who are you?" And for the first time in 2 years, Ethan Cole told a partial truth to someone who wasn't his daughter. "A maintenance technician," he said, "who used to do something else." He picked up his toolbox. His shift ended in 40 minutes. He had breakfast to make. Nobody asked him to stay. That was the thing he noticed first, walking out of the Level B control center at 3:44 in the morning. Nobody stopped him. Nobody followed him into the corridor. Nobody said, "Wait, we have questions. We need a statement. We need you to explain what just happened in front of witnesses." The door swung shut behind him, and the sound of the room, the low murmur of engineers confirming system status, the executive already on the phone with someone, Isabella Hartwell's quiet voice cutting through everything else, was just gone, like stepping out of a theater mid-scene. He stood in the basement corridor for a moment. The overhead lights were on their night setting, dim and slightly yellow. The air smelled like concrete and conduit insulation. Somewhere above him, 43 floors of the most advanced technology company on the eastern seaboard was processing what had just happened. He rolled his shoulder again, picked up his toolbox, walked to the service elevator. He had 22 minutes left on his shift. He used them to complete the HVAC inspection he'd abandoned on the 6th floor when the alarm sounded. Checked the 3 remaining duct seals, logged everything correctly, replaced a worn gasket on a return air coupling that had been slowly degrading for about 6 weeks. He wrote it up in his log with the same flat precision he wrote everything. Gasket degradation, return air coupling, Unit 6C, replaced. Monitor quarterly. At 4:07, he clocked out at the security desk. Philip had been replaced by the morning security guard, a younger woman named Danica who barely looked up from her monitor when he badged out. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said, not looking up. He drove home through the dark. The Civic's heat was working again. Small mercies. He didn't think about the control room. He didn't think about the code he'd found buried in the load-balancing subroutine, or about what it meant that it was there, or about the specific expertise required to plant something like that without tripping the system's native diagnostic flags. He didn't think about Isabella Hartwell's face when the boards went green, or the particular quality of the silence in that room. He thought about what Mia wanted for breakfast. She'd been on a waffle kick for 3 weeks. They were out of the blueberry ones, which were the only ones that counted. He made a note to stop at the grocery store before she woke up. He didn't stop at the grocery store. He was too tired. He made her scrambled eggs instead, and she ate them without complaint, which was either maturity or an indication that she was coming down with something. "You feel okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. "Why do you always ask that when I'm not complaining?" Because usually you complain. She considered this with the particular 7-year-old expression that meant she was deciding whether to be offended or whether he had a point. I like eggs, she said finally, with great dignity. I just also like waffles. I know. I'll get the blueberry ones today. You said that yesterday. Today I mean it. She gave him the look she'd inherited from Sarah, the one that communicated, without any hostility, that she was keeping track. Then she went back to her eggs. He got the blueberry waffles. He also slept 4.5 hours, which was 45 minutes more than usual, and when he woke up, it was to 3 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize, and 1 voicemail from Gerald Marsh. He listened to the voicemail first. Marsh's voice was the voice of a man who had spent a sleepless night recalibrating his understanding of the hierarchy he thought he managed. It had the slightly stretched quality of someone choosing each word with more care than usual. Mr. Cole, this is Gerald Marsh, Facilities Director at Hartwell Technologies. I'm calling to, request your presence at a brief meeting this afternoon. 2 o'clock if that works. Executive Conference Room, 38th floor. Ms. Hartwell would like to speak with you. Please confirm with my assistant. He played it again. Then he set the phone face down on the kitchen table and sat with that for a minute. 38th floor. He'd never been above the 10th floor in this building. The 38th floor was where the executive suites lived, the offices with the views of the harbor, the conference rooms with the catered lunch spreads, the entire altitude of the company that existed in a different atmospheric layer from the service corridors and boiler rooms and flickering fluorescent break rooms where his actual work happened. He called the unknown number back. It was Marsh's assistant, a woman who was extremely efficient and had the particular tone of someone who managed a lot of other people's awkwardness professionally. She confirmed the 2 o'clock. She gave him the conference room number. She mentioned that building access for the 38th floor would be arranged through security and that he should bring his employee ID, like he might not know to bring his employee ID. He said, "Thank you," and hung up. He sat at the kitchen table for another minute. Through the window, Mrs. Papadopoulos was doing something to her garden that appeared to involve aggressively relocating a rosebush. The November light was flat and gray and honest. He had approximately 3 hours before he needed to leave. He used one of them writing a detailed technical summary of what he'd found in the Helios system the night before, not because anyone had asked him to, but because the habit of documentation ran deep enough in him that going into that meeting without it felt wrong. He wrote it by hand in his personal notebook, not in the official maintenance log. Precise, complete, reference to the specific code layers and subroutine architecture. When he was done, he read it back once and decided it was accurate. He showered. He changed into the better of his 2 pairs of non-work pants and a dark blue shirt that Sarah had once said made him look like a person who had his life together, which had been funny at the time in a way that was specific to knowing exactly how not together his life was. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror for a moment, the jaw that hadn't been shaved in 4 days, the eyes that always looked slightly like he was calculating something, the shoulders that he'd been told more than once looked like a man carrying something heavier than whatever was actually in his hands. He didn't fix any of it. He wasn't going up there to impress anyone. He drove to Hartwell Technologies and parked in the employee lot and went in through the front entrance for the first time since he'd started working there. The lobby was different from the front. The waterfall feature was more impressive from this angle. A large reception desk staffed by 2 people who were clearly accustomed to the business of managing first impressions. Marble floors. The company logo in brushed steel on the back wall. Above it, in the same brushed steel, 3 words: power, clarity, progress. He gave his name at reception. They checked a list, made a phone call. The security clearance for the 38th floor came through in under 2 minutes, which told him this meeting had been arranged with some priority. In the elevator, alone, he watched the floor numbers climb. He thought about the code he'd found, about the sequence it had run, about the 2 voices he'd heard in the basement corridor 3 nights ago say, "We buried it deep enough," and about the fact that he had not yet decided what to do with that memory. The elevator opened on the 38th floor, and the first thing he noticed was that it smelled different up here. Not better exactly, just different. Like the air had been conditioned to a more specific standard. A young woman he didn't recognize was waiting for him. She introduced herself as Claire, Ms. Hartwell's executive coordinator, and walked him down a corridor that was carpeted and quiet and lined with the kind of abstract art that companies bought to signal something about themselves without being specific about what. The conference room was at the end of the hall. Claire opened the door, said, "He's here," and stepped aside. It was a large room, floor-to-ceiling windows showing a gray November harbor, a long table with 10 chairs, 3 people sitting at it. Gerald Marsh, who looked like he hadn't slept, a man Ethan didn't recognize in a suit that probably cost more than a month of his rent, and Isabella Hartwell. She was sitting at the head of the table, not the geographic head. She'd taken a chair on the long side near the window, which was a small but interesting choice. She had a tablet in front of her and a coffee cup she hadn't touched. She was looking at him when he walked in. "Mr. Cole," she said, "thank you for coming." The please and thank you of it was formal and slightly unfamiliar on her, like a language she spoke correctly but not natively. "Sure," he said. He sat down across from her. He put his personal notebook on the table in front of him, closed. The man he didn't recognize introduced himself as Richard Yao, Chief Technology Officer. He had the look of someone who was very good at his job and was currently in the process of reassessing things he'd assumed about his own domain. He nodded at Ethan with the careful courtesy of a man who knows he's in a complicated situation. "We'd like to understand what you did last night," Yao said. "In terms of the system intervention, can you walk us through it?" Ethan opened his notebook to the summary he'd written that morning. He walked them through it. He didn't oversimplify and he didn't perform. He just explained what he'd found, in the sequence he'd found it, and what he'd done about it. He used technical language where technical language was accurate and plain language where it wasn't necessary to be technical. Marsh took notes. Yao asked 3 sharp, precise questions that told Ethan he was actually following what was being said. Isabella Hartwell said nothing. She watched him the way she'd watched the tablet during the inspection, with the focused, unblinking attention of someone processing information and not yet ready to share what she was making of it. When he finished, there was a brief silence. "The embedded code," Yao said, "the cascade initiator you described. You're saying that was deliberate." "I'm saying it was written deliberately," Ethan said. "Whether someone intended it as sabotage or as something else, that's a different question. But nobody accidentally writes a piece of code that looks like a fail-safe protocol and functions as a cascade trigger. That takes time and knowledge." "Knowledge of our specific system architecture," Yao said. He said it the way you say something you've been sitting with for several hours and are not enjoying. "Yes." Another silence. "How did you know how to find it?" Isabella said. It was the first time she'd spoken since he'd sat down. Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it, something genuinely, almost reluctantly curious. "Our engineering team has been running diagnostics on Helios for 6 months. They didn't find anything." Ethan looked at her. He thought about what to say and how much of it to say. "Because they were running forward diagnostics," he said, "looking for what was failing. I looked at the failure sequence itself and read it backwards. It told me what I needed to know about where to look." "That's not a standard diagnostic methodology," Yao said. "No," Ethan agreed. "It's not." The room was quiet. Outside the windows, a container ship was moving slowly across the harbor. Isabella leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Cole, I'm going to ask you something directly." "Okay." "Who are you?" "And I don't mean your employee file. Your employee file says you've been with facilities management for 14 months. Prior employment listed as independent contractor, references checked out, no flags." "That's what the file says." She paused. "The file doesn't explain last night." He looked at his notebook, at the closed cover of it, at the careful, complete documentation of a system he'd disassembled and rebuilt from memory in 31 minutes, using techniques that didn't exist in any publicly available engineering literature. He'd known, somewhere between the parking lot and the elevator, that this moment was coming. He'd had time to decide what to do with it. He'd made a decision in the elevator, watching the numbers climb. "Before I came to Boston," he said, "I spent 8 years as a systems architect. Military-grade energy infrastructure. I designed, built, and audited power grid systems for applications I can't be specific about. The classification on most of it is still active." Nobody in the room moved. The principles that Helios is built on, he continued, are adapted from frameworks that I personally worked on in a previous version, about 6 years ago. I recognize the architecture because I know its origins. That's why I could navigate it the way I did. Yao set his pen down. Marsh made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Isabella Hartwell stared at him. For the first time since he'd walked in, her expression changed in a way that was clearly involuntary. Not shock, exactly. She was too controlled for shock to show cleanly. But something. A reassessment happening in real time behind her eyes. You designed the framework that Helios is based on, she said slowly. A version of it. Your engineering team did significant development work on top of the original. But the core architecture, the node synchronization logic, the load balancing subroutine structure, I know that code. I wrote some of it. And you're working in my building as a maintenance technician, she said. It wasn't a question exactly. It was more like something she was saying out loud to make it real. Yes. Why? He'd expected that question. He'd thought about how to answer it. He gave her the honest version, which was also the short version. My wife died 2 years ago. I have a 7-year-old daughter. I needed a schedule I could control and a job that I could leave at the door when I came home. I wasn't interested in going back to the kind of work I used to do. The room absorbed that. Marsh looked at the table. Yao looked at Ethan with an expression that was somewhere between professional respect and something more personal. Isabella looked at him for a long time without speaking. Something moved through her expression that he couldn't fully name. Not sympathy, exactly, or not only that. Something more complicated. The look of a person who has just been handed a data point that doesn't fit any of their existing models and is deciding whether to be unsettled by that or not. I'm sorry about your wife, she said. She said it simply, without ornamentation. Like she meant it, but didn't want to perform meaning it. Thank you, he said. A beat of quiet. Then Richard Yao said, Mr. Cole, the piece of code you found, the cascade initiator, you isolated it, but you didn't remove it entirely, correct? Correct. Removing it completely would have required taking Helios offline for a full audit cycle. I routed around it and stabilized the system, but it's still in there, dormant for now. But if something triggers the right conditions again, it activates, Yao said. It activates. And next time, whoever planted it might have a second layer underneath. I only found one piece. I don't know if that's all there is. Yao and Isabella exchanged a look. Something passed between them, the kind of shorthand that develops between people who have worked together for years in high-stakes environments. An entire conversation in 2 seconds. We need a full audit, Isabella said. Not to the room, to Ethan. Yes. How long? He thought about it properly. The scope of Helios, the layers he'd need to examine, the fact that whatever he was looking for had been hidden by someone who knew the system at a deep level. If I have unrestricted access and I'm not managing anything else, 4 days, maybe 5. Depends on what I find. You'll have unrestricted access, she said. She said it like it was already done, which Ethan suspected was generally how she made decisions. Richard will assign you a secondary engineer, not to supervise, to support. You lead the audit. Yao nodded like this was already settled in his head too. Ms. Hartwell, Marsh said, with the specific tone of someone who manages risk professionally and is watching a risk management situation develop in real time. If we're assigning audit authority to an outside... He's not outside, Isabella said, without looking at Marsh. He's been an employee for 14 months. The authority is assigned. She paused. Is there a problem with that, Gerald? Marsh looked at his notepad. No, he said. Good. She looked back at Ethan. Whatever you need, whatever access levels, whatever technical support, whatever time. The federal review is in 9 days. I need to know what's in that system before the federal team walks in. Understood, Ethan said. She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then she looked down at her tablet and the meeting moved to logistics. Access protocols, documentation requirements, the secondary engineer Yao would assign, the chain of reporting for anything Ethan found. It was businesslike and fast, and Ethan followed it without difficulty. He left the conference room 40 minutes later with a temporary executive-level access badge, Yao's direct contact number, and the name of the engineer he'd be working with starting the next morning. Claire walked him back to the elevator. In the corridor, she said, almost as an aside, "Ms. Hartwell doesn't usually run meetings like that." "Like what?" Ethan said. Claire seemed to consider how specific to be. "Like she doesn't already have all the answers," she said. And then the elevator arrived and the conversation was over. He drove home. He stopped at the grocery store and bought the blueberry waffles. When Mia got off the school bus at 3:15, she walked in to find them on the counter and said, "You got them," with the particular satisfaction of a person whose faith has been validated. "I got them," he said. She sat at the kitchen table and did her homework while he made dinner, and outside Mrs. Papadopoulos' relocated rosebush was already looking uncertain about its new position, and the streetlight in front of the house was still out, and the photograph in the upstairs hallway would be crooked again by morning. He went back to Hartwell Technologies the next day with a different badge and a different level of access, and when he badged through the Level B control center door and stood in front of the Helios console, the secondary engineer Yao had assigned, a quiet woman named Dr. Priya Anand, who had 2 PhDs and the specific kind of focused competence that didn't need to announce itself, was already there, waiting. "Dr. Anand," he said. "Mr. Cole?" she said. She had a tablet and a printed schematic of the Helios architecture that she'd clearly been studying already. "I read your incident summary from last night, the one you submitted to Yao this morning." He hadn't submitted it to Yao. He'd written it in his personal notebook and brought it to the meeting. Then apparently Yao had asked Claire to transcribe it from the photograph he'd taken of the pages. "Yao's thorough," he said. "He's terrified," she said, matter-of-factly, which in this situation is the appropriate response. She looked at the schematic. "Where do you want to start?" He looked at the console. At the Helios status indicators, all green, the system humming along in its recovered stability like nothing had happened. The cascade initiator was still in there, buried in the load-balancing subroutine, dormant and patient, and possibly not alone. "The bottom," he said. "We start from the deepest architecture layer and work up." She nodded and pulled up the access interface. They worked for 7 hours that day. They found nothing in the first 2 layers, which was what Ethan had expected. Whoever had put the first piece in had known the obvious places to hide things were the obvious places not to hide things. They found a second anomaly in the 3rd layer, embedded in a routing protocol that hadn't been touched in the system's initial development phase and hadn't been flagged because it had never caused a problem. It wasn't a trigger. It was more like a door, a mechanism that, under specific network conditions, would allow external access to a section of the Helios architecture that was supposed to be fully isolated. He and Priya sat with that for a while. "Someone wanted to be able to get back in," she said. "Or someone wanted to be able to prove they could get in," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him. "What's the difference?" "One is sabotage. The other is leverage." She was quiet for a moment. "You think someone inside this company is using access to Helios as a bargaining chip?" "I think it's possible," he said. "I think we need to know who wrote the original code for these 2 anomalies before we can say anything more definite than that." She looked at the screen, then at him. "Yao has the development logs, names, dates, commit histories." "Yes," he said, "he does." He called Yao that afternoon. Yao listened to the summary of the second finding without interruption and then was quiet for 4 seconds, which was longer than Yao's usual processing time. "You need the development logs," Yao said. "I need the development logs." Another pause. "I'll have them for you by tomorrow morning." A beat. "Cole, is this going to get worse before it gets better?" Ethan looked at the Helios console, at the 3rd architecture layer still open on the screen, the hidden door sitting there in the code like something that had been waiting a long time to be found. "Probably," he said. Yao said something under his breath that wasn't quite a word. Then, "All right, tomorrow morning I'll send them to your secure access folder." He ended the call. Priya was still studying the screen. "You know," she said, not looking away from the code, "I've worked at this company for 4 years. I've been on the Helios team for 2 of them. I thought I knew this system." You knew the surface of it, Ethan said, not unkindly. Yeah, she paused. What do you know about the rest of it? The parts we haven't gotten to yet? He thought about the answer honestly. Enough to be concerned, he said. Not enough to be certain. She nodded. Good enough, she said. Let's keep going. They stayed until 7. He texted the neighbor's daughter, who picked Mia up from the after-school program on late nights. A college student named Jade, who Mia adored because Jade let her watch shows Ethan had put a soft veto on, and confirmed coverage. Mia texted him at 5:15. Did you eat dinner? Which was a reversal of the usual dynamic and made him smile in a way that was slightly complicated. Eating now, he texted back. It was not strictly true. He was looking at a vending machine in the level B break room, trying to decide between a granola bar and a pack of crackers. He got both. He ate them standing at the console while Priya ran an automated scan he designed to flag anomalies in the remaining architecture layers. At 7, he drove home. The Civic's heater was working. The streetlight was still out. The photograph in the upstairs hallway was already slightly crooked before he'd even gone to bed. He lay in the dark of his bedroom and thought about what Priya had said. Someone wanted to be able to get back in, or leverage, or both. And the two voices in the basement corridor, we buried it deep enough. He'd heard that 12 days ago and filed it away, and it had been waiting patiently for the rest of the picture to develop. He thought about the development logs that Yao would have for him tomorrow morning, about names and dates and commit histories, about who, inside Hartwell Technologies, had known the Helios architecture deeply enough to hide something inside it that even the company's own engineers hadn't found in 6 months of standard diagnostics. He thought about the morning of the walkthrough, the server room, the relay component in his hand, someone who knows nothing about what actually runs this building. The room laughing with the automatic compliance of people who understood that laughing was the safer option. He hadn't been angry then. He hadn't been much of anything then. He just kept walking. He was starting to be something now. Not anger. Something cooler and more systematic than anger. The specific alertness that had once been his default state and that he had spent 2 years trying to put down. Not because it was bad exactly, but because it belonged to a version of his life that he'd walked away from deliberately, with both hands, because something else had needed to come first. Something else still needed to come first. Mia's class picture was Friday. He needed to remember that. He reached over and set his alarm for 5:30. Then he lay there in the dark for a while longer, listening to the house settle around him, thinking about buried code and hidden doors, and what it meant when the people responsible for keeping a system safe had become the most dangerous thing inside it. The development logs arrived at 6:47 in the morning, 43 minutes before Ethan had told himself he'd start looking at them. He was already at the kitchen table with his second cup of coffee when the notification came through on the secure access tablet Yao had issued him the day before. Mia was still asleep. The house was doing its early morning thing, the radiator ticking, the refrigerator running its quiet cycle, the particular quality of silence that exists in a home before the person who makes it loud is awake. He'd come to depend on that silence in a way he hadn't expected in the years since. It was the only part of the day that was fully his. He opened the logs. The Helios development archive was extensive. 3 years of commit histories, code reviews, modification records, access timestamps. Thousands of entries. He'd worked with archives like this before, in a different context, in a different life. And he knew that the thing you were looking for was almost never in the place that looked like it should contain it. You looked at the edges, the entries with unusual timestamps, the modifications that were logged correctly but reviewed too quickly, the access records that showed someone in a section of the codebase they had no documented reason to be in. He worked through the logs for an hour before Mia came downstairs in her pajamas and the rain jacket, which she had apparently begun sleeping in, and he closed the tablet and made her breakfast, and walked her to the bus stop and stood on the sidewalk watching the bus pull away in the gray November morning, and then he went back inside and opened the tablet again. By 10:30, he had a list of 6 names, not all 6 for the same reason. 2 of them had accessed the load balancing subroutine, the location of the first embedded trigger, during a period when the official development log showed no scheduled work on that module. The access was logged, which meant whoever it was hadn't tried to erase their tracks, which meant either they were confident nobody would look, or they had reason to believe the logs weren't being monitored. Both possibilities were uncomfortable in different ways. A third name appeared on access records for the routing protocol layer, the location of the second anomaly, the hidden door, on a date 14 months ago, which was 3 months before the Helios system had officially moved into its integration testing phase. That was too early for anyone to have legitimate business in that layer. The remaining 3 names were less clear. Pattern anomalies, while people who had accessed adjacent systems in ways that were consistent with normal engineering work, but had a particular rhythm that his instincts flagged, and his instincts, after years of reading systems that people had tried to hide things inside, were not usually wrong. He sent the list to Priya with a short note asking her to cross-reference against current employment status and project assignments. Then he drove to Hartwell Technologies. Priya was in the Level B control center when he arrived. She had the Helios 4th architecture layer open on the main console and the expression of someone who had been there for a while already. "You got the logs," she said, not as a question. "I got the logs." "And?" He pulled up a chair next to her at the console and set the tablet down between them. She read the list. She read it again. He watched her face go through 3 distinct phases: recognition, recalibration, and then a careful, deliberate stillness that he'd come to recognize in the last 2 days as the way Priya Anand handled information that was significantly worse than she expected. "Marcus Webb," she said quietly. "You know him. He's the senior development architect on the Helios project. He's been with the company for 6 years. She paused. "He's presenting the system to the Federal Review Panel. He's the face of the project. His access logs show him in the load balancing subroutine on a Sunday evening 8 months ago," Ethan said. "No scheduled work, no documentation. The session lasted 47 minutes. She stared at the tablet. "He could have an explanation." "He could," Ethan said. "That's not for me to determine." "What about the second name, Donovan Reese?" "Head of Network Infrastructure. His access record on the routing protocol layer puts him there 2 months before integration testing started, at 11:14 on a Tuesday night." Priya said nothing for a moment. Then, "Donovan Reese plays golf with Gerald Marsh on Saturdays." Ethan absorbed that. "Does he?" "And Marcus Webb was promoted 8 months ago." She looked at Ethan. 8 months ago. Right around the time his access log shows him in a module he had no documented reason to be in. The room was quiet except for the hum of the Helios system, running clean and stable and entirely unaware of what was being uncovered around it. "This goes above engineering," Priya said. "Yes. This is, if what you're describing is accurate, this is executive-level coordination. Someone with enough access and enough standing to plant code in a flagship system and cover it by hiding in plain sight." She stopped. "And if it's Marcus and Donovan both, that's not one person acting alone. That's an organized effort. Or 2 people acting independently for related reasons," Ethan said. "We don't have enough yet to know which." She looked at the list of 6 names. "What do you want to do with this?" He thought about it the way he thought about everything that mattered. Practically, with the specific part of his brain that was trained to separate what he knew from what he suspected, and what he suspected from what he needed to prove. "I want to find the third piece first," he said. "If there's a third piece, we've found a trigger and a door. Those 2 things together suggest a mechanism, a trigger to create the crisis, a door to access the system during the chaos. That implies someone intended to use the crisis as cover for something." Priya was ahead of him. He could see it in her eyes. "Access the Helios system through the back door during the emergency restart," she said. "Everyone's focused on the failure. Nobody's watching the incoming connection. And whatever they accessed or extracted or modified during that window would be buried under the noise of the incident report," Ethan said. "By the time anyone looked at the access logs, the emergency would have overwritten the priority." She sat back in her chair. "Except you didn't do the restart." "Except I didn't do the restart," he said. They looked at each other for a moment. "So whatever they planned to do," Priya said slowly, "during the window that the restart was supposed to create, they didn't get to do it." "No." which means whoever is behind this knows the plan failed. Yes, and knows it failed because of you. Ethan said nothing. That was the part he'd been sitting with since somewhere around 3 in the morning, in the dark of his bedroom, while the photograph in the hallway sat crooked on its nail. Someone inside Hartwell Technologies had spent months, possibly longer, engineering a specific opportunity, and a maintenance technician who wasn't supposed to know anything had walked into the control room at the wrong moment and taken it apart in 31 minutes. That person, or those people, now knew that. They knew the system had been stabilized. They knew there was an audit underway. They didn't know how much the audit had found. Yet. "We need to move faster," Ethan said. They spent the next 6 hours going through the 4th and 5th architecture layers with a precision that left Ethan's eyes burning by mid-afternoon. They found a third anomaly in the 5th layer, smaller than the others, more sophisticated, the kind of thing that would have taken him another full day to find if he hadn't known by now what he was looking for. It wasn't a trigger and it wasn't a door. It was a recorder, a passive logging mechanism that had been capturing data packets from the Helios system's Federal Interface Protocol for an indeterminate period, capturing and storing them in a partitioned memory block that was technically inside the Helios architecture but entirely off the system's standard monitoring grid. Priya stared at it. "It's been collecting data." "Government contract specifications," Ethan said. "Integration protocols, federal facility network parameters. Everything that gets routed through the federal interface during the review process." He paused. "If that data makes it out through the back door during a chaotic emergency restart, it's not just sabotage, it's extraction." The word landed in the room like something physical. Priya sat very still. "We need to go upstairs," she said. Not a question, not a suggestion. The tone of someone who has just recalibrated their understanding of the severity of the situation they're inside. "We need to go upstairs," Ethan agreed. He called Yao first. Yao picked up on the second ring, listened to a 90-second summary without interrupting, and said, "How soon can you be in my office? 15 minutes? Make it 10. Yao's office was on the 36th floor, 2 floors below the executive level, and it looked like the office of a man who thought very hard and moved very fast, and didn't spend a lot of time worrying about what the space looked like. There were 2 monitors, a whiteboard covered in system architecture diagrams, a bookshelf that had stopped being decorative sometime around the first year and was now purely functional, and a standing desk he wasn't using because he was pacing when Ethan and Priya walked in. He closed the door behind them, looked at the tablet Ethan handed him, read the summary of all 3 anomalies and the associated access logs and the names. Then he set the tablet down and put both hands flat on his desk and looked at the wall for a moment. "Marcus Webb," he said. "His prints are on the first piece," Ethan said. "Reese's are on the second. The third doesn't have a clear attribution yet. It was planted earlier and more carefully." "How much earlier?" "Possibly before Helios went into development phase. It would have required someone with architectural access at the framework level." Yao looked at him. The specific, weighted look of someone connecting a chain of dots they would prefer not to connect. "Framework level access," he said. "That's a very small group of people." "How small?" 4, Webb, Reese, myself." He stopped. "And?" Ethan said. Yao's jaw tightened. "And the person who brought Helios in-house from its original development source, the one who negotiated the licensing and supervised the integration." He paused for a long time. "David Holt, Executive VP of Technology Strategy." The name sat there. "Holt reports directly to Isabella," Yao said. He said it like he was tasting something he hadn't expected. "He's been with the company since the beginning. She trusts him." Priya looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Yao. "She needs to know," Ethan said. Yao rubbed his face with both hands. It was the first time Ethan had seen him do anything that was purely human and unguarded, and it lasted about 3 seconds before the composure came back. "I know," Yao said. "I know she does." He straightened. "I'll arrange the meeting. Tonight, if she's available." He looked at Ethan. "You'll need to present this directly. All of it. She won't take it secondhand." "I know," Ethan said. He thought briefly about Jade and Mia and what time he'd need to make arrangements by. Then he thought about David Holt and the framework-level access that had allowed someone to plant a data recorder inside a government contract system before the project had even officially begun. The sequence of that, the patience it implied, the specific kind of institutional betrayal that required years of accumulated trust as its primary tool. "Set the meeting," he said. Isabella Hartwell's personal office was different from the conference room. It was on the 39th floor, the top of the building, and it had the harbor on two sides, which should have made it feel expansive, but somehow didn't. It felt like the inside of a very focused mind. The desk was large and clear except for one monitor and a single legal pad. The furniture was functional and expensive in the way of things chosen for longevity rather than impression. There were no photographs on the walls, no personal items visible, nothing that told you who this person was when the building emptied out. She was standing when they came in, not pacing, standing at the window, looking at the harbor, the November dark turning the water black and the lights of the city reflecting in broken pieces across it. She turned when they entered. Yao was with them. He'd been quiet in the elevator. She looked at Ethan first, then at the tablet in his hand. "Tell me," she said. He told her. All of it. In sequence. The trigger, the door, the recorder, the access logs, the 6 names, and the 3 that had risen to the surface. Webb, Reese, and the third, the earliest, the one that required framework-level access and a window of time that predated the project's official development phase. He said David Holt's name at the end. The room went very quiet. Isabella's face during the presentation had been the face he'd seen in the control room during the crisis. Controlled, processing, not letting what she was processing show until she was ready to let it show. But when he said Holt's name, something happened. Not collapse. Nothing that dramatic. It was smaller and more real than that. A slight change around the eyes. The specific look of someone absorbing a betrayal they didn't see coming, which was always worse than the ones you did. She was silent for a long moment. "How certain are you?" she said. Her voice was steady. Whatever was happening inside it, the voice held. "The access logs are factual," Ethan said. "The technical evidence of all 3 anomalies is documented and replicable. The attribution of the first 2, Webb and Reese-Coase, is supported by timestamp and session data. Holt's connection to the third piece is circumstantial at this stage. He had the access and the window. Whether he used it is a question the logs suggest but don't conclusively answer." She nodded slowly. She was still looking at him. "But you think it was him?" He paused for a moment. "I think whoever planted the third piece knew the Helios architecture before anyone else in this building did. That's a very specific kind of knowledge. Holt brought the framework in-house. That's not circumstantial. That's structural." She turned back to the window. Ethan watched her shoulder blades tighten almost imperceptibly under her jacket. She stood there for maybe 15 seconds, which was a long time to stand in silence in front of other people when you were the kind of person who usually controlled the pace of every room she was in. "David Holt has been with this company for 11 years, she said to the window. "He was on the founding team. I hired him personally." A pause. "He was at my father's funeral." Nobody in the room said anything. She turned around. Her expression had settled back into something that was almost composed, but the something that had come loose earlier was still there, just pushed to one side. "What's the scope of the exposure?" she said. "If the recorder has been running and the data was accessed." "It wasn't," Ethan said. "The back door was never activated. The emergency restart didn't happen. The data is still in the partition block. But it's been collecting. For an estimated 7 months, based on the log architecture. It has a copy of every federal interface session in that period." She closed her eyes briefly, opened them. 7 months of federal integration data. Yes. She looked at Yao. "Who else knows about this? Outside this room?" "Priya Anand," Yao said. "She's been running the audit with Cole, nobody else." "Keep it that way for now." She looked at her desk, at the legal pad, at the blank surface of a situation she was visibly calculating. "Webb and Reese are still in the building. They're on normal project assignments," Yao said carefully. "And Holt?" Ethan said. He's at a partner conference in Washington, Isabella said. Back on Friday. She said it the way you state facts that have suddenly become tactical information. He'll know about the audit, Priya said, speaking for the first time since they'd entered the office. Isabella looked at her. Explain. If he's connected to this, he's been watching the system. He'll know the emergency restart didn't happen. He'll know there's been unusual activity in the architecture since Monday. He might not know exactly what we found, but he knows something is wrong with the plan. Priya paused. The conference in Washington might not be coincidence. Another silence. You think he went to distance himself? Isabella said. I think it's worth considering. Isabella was quiet for a moment. Then she did something Ethan hadn't expected. She sat down. Not at her desk. In one of the chairs by the window, which struck him as a more human choice than the desk. She sat in it the way a person sits when they're not performing sitting, just doing it because they need to. I need to think about this carefully, she said, not because I doubt what you found, because the way I handle this in the next 48 hours will determine whether we contain it or blow it open in a way that we can't control. She looked at Ethan. You said Webb and Reese are the clear attributions. Yes. If I address them directly, remove them from the project, initiate an internal investigation, Holt will know we're moving. He has enough seniority to see what's happening even from Washington. Unless we give him a reason to believe the investigation is scoped narrowly, Ethan said. She looked at him with the specific attention of someone encountering an idea they want to examine. Say that again. Webb and Reese are visible. Their anomalies are clean, timestamps, sessions, names attached. If the official scope of the audit appears to stop at Webb and Reese, Holt might believe the third piece wasn't found. He paused. The recorder is the most sophisticated of the three. It's possible he thinks it would take longer to find. She was looking at him very directly now. You want to use the investigation itself as a trap. I want to give the investigation a publicly narrow scope while running a parallel track on the Holt connection. If he thinks the exposure stops at Webb and Reese, he may make a move to protect the third piece before we can formally attribute it to him. Any move he makes will generate its own evidence. Yao shifted in his chair. That's a significant legal risk. If he discovers we've been running parallel investigations, he already knows the plan is compromised, Ethan said. He just doesn't know how much. Every day we don't move is a day he has to cover more ground. Isabella stared at the window for a long moment. The harbor lights moved in the black water below. She was working through something. He could see it, the deliberate internal processing of a person who made consequential decisions for a living and knew better than to make them fast just because the situation wanted her to. Remove Webb and Reese tomorrow, she said finally. Full administrative suspension, pending internal review. Make the announcement at board level. Don't hide it, but scope it to the project integrity question. Nothing about the data recorder. Nothing about the federal exposure. She looked at Ethan. Continue the audit on the third piece. Find something that removes the circumstantial qualifier. I'll need more time in the architecture. You have it. And if Holt reaches out to you from Washington, I'll answer normally, she said. Flat and final. I've had 11 years of practice talking to David Holt. I can manage 2 more days. She stood up. The meeting was over in the way her meetings were always over. She moved and the gravity of the room moved with her. Mr. Cole, she said, before he reached the door. He turned. She was standing by the window again, her back partially to the room, looking out at the harbor. In the reflection of the dark glass, he could see her face. Not performing composure now, just wearing the actual version of it, which was harder and less polished and considerably more real. You could have walked out of that control room Monday night and never said another word, she said. Filed the incident report, done your shift, gone home. She paused. Why didn't you? He thought about the honest answer, about the corridor, 3 nights before the failure, and 2 voices that had said buried deep enough, about his maintenance log and the 2 words he'd written underneath the official entry, about the years when walking away from something broken had not been an available option. Because I knew what I was looking at, he said, and once you know, walking away is a decision too. She didn't turn around, but something in her reflection shifted, something in the set of her jaw, the angle of her shoulders. She nodded once, slightly, to the glass. He left. In the elevator going down, Priya stood next to him, and Yao stood on the other side, and nobody spoke until the 22nd floor, when Priya said quietly, "She's going to remove 2 senior executives tomorrow morning." "Yes," Ethan said. "That's going to cost her." "I know." "Does she know?" He thought about Isabella sitting in the chair by the window, not at her desk, the way someone sits when they've stopped calculating and started deciding. "Yeah," he said. "She knows." He drove home at 9:15. Jade had given Mia dinner and stayed until he got back, which he appreciated more than he said. Mia was in her pajamas and marginally asleep when he checked on her, which meant she was fully awake and pretending, which was a game they'd been playing since she was 4. He sat on the edge of her bed. "I know you're awake," he said. A pause, then, "How was work?" "Long." "Did you eat dinner?" "Yes," he said. This time it was true. Priya had produced sandwiches from somewhere around 6 o'clock, with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a person who understood that sustained concentration required fuel and wasn't going to wait for someone to suggest it. "Good," Mia said. She rolled over and looked at him in the dark. She had Sarah's eyes, brown and direct and fully committed to whatever they were looking at. "Are you okay?" He thought about what okay meant from inside a situation that had gone from a relay switch to potential federal data extraction in 72 hours. "I'm fine," he said. She studied his face for a moment with the specific 7-year-old instinct that children have before they learn to be polite about what they notice. "You look tired," she said. "I am tired." "Then sleep." "I will." He tucked the blanket up around her. Gerald the elephant was present. "Class picture is Friday." "I know," she said, already drifting. "What are you going to wear?" A long pause that might have been sleep, then, faintly, the rain jacket. He sat there for a moment after her breathing evened out. Then he stood, straightened the blanket, and went to the door. In the hallway, the photograph was crooked. He straightened it. Sarah laughing at something off camera, hair going sideways, hand on Mia's shoulder. Him looking at Sarah instead of the lens. He stood there for a moment longer than usual. Then he went downstairs, sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea he wouldn't finish, and opened the secure tablet to the Helios 4th-layer architecture he hadn't finished examining. The recorder sat in the partitioned block, patient and still, full of 7 months of federal interface data that had been collected by someone who had known what they were doing long before any of this had begun to show on any surface. He opened the commit history for the framework integration period, 14 months ago, the earliest possible window, and started reading. It took him until 1 in the morning to find it. Not a name in the access log. Something quieter than that. A single line of commentary embedded in the original framework documentation in a notation style that was subtly different from every other notation in the archive. Shorter, more compressed, the syntax of someone who had learned to document code in a specific environment that used different conventions. He recognized the conventions the way you recognize the accent of a place you've lived. He sat very still at the kitchen table for a long moment. Then he took a photograph of the screen, sent it to Priya and Yao, both with a single line of text, and closed the tablet. Outside, the streetlight was still out. Mrs. Papadopoulos's rosebush was a dark shape in the flat November night. The house was entirely quiet. He drank the cold tea. All of it this time. The photograph on the wall upstairs was already crooked again. He didn't go back up to straighten it. Some things you had to let sit crooked until morning. The photograph Ethan sent at 1 in the morning sat in Priya's inbox until 5:47, when she opened it and called him before he'd finished making coffee. "The notation style," she said, without preamble. "You see it. It's compressed. The comment syntax is, it's not standard. It's not even close to the documentation conventions the rest of the Helios team uses." A pause, and he could hear her moving, the sound of a chair, a door closing. "Where's that from?" "A specific development environment," Ethan said. "Used primarily in defense contracting, particular to a network of contractors who worked on government infrastructure projects in the early part of the last decade." He set his coffee down. "I used that syntax for 6 years." Priya was quiet for a moment. "So whoever left that notation worked in the same world I worked in, before Hartwell, before any of this. He stared at the window. The morning was still dark, the November sky doing nothing useful. David Holt's official biography says he came from private sector infrastructure consulting. Stanford MBA, 15 years in energy sector development. You think the biography is incomplete? I think a person doesn't learn that notation style in private sector infrastructure consulting. That syntax comes from a specific context, a specific clearance level. She was quiet again. He could hear her processing it the way she processed everything. Systematically, without rushing, which was one of the things he'd come to appreciate about her in the 4 days they'd been working together. She didn't perform thinking, she just did it. If Holt has a defense background he didn't disclose, she said, and he brought the Helios framework in-house, knowing its origins, knowing what it was built on, then his interest in the federal contract isn't just professional, Ethan said. It's personal, or it's transactional. Either way, it goes somewhere beyond corporate ambition. We need to take this to Isabella today, Priya said. I know. I want one more thing first. He picked up his coffee again. The recorder in the fifth layer, Siem. I want to know where it was routing the collected data. It captured 7 months of federal interface sessions. It has to have been sending them somewhere, or preparing to. Find me the destination architecture. That's more concrete than a notation style. That'll take most of the morning. I know. Start without me. I'll be there by 9. He drove Mia to school himself that morning instead of the bus. He didn't tell her why. She didn't ask, just climbed in the passenger seat with her backpack and Gerald the elephant tucked under one arm, because she had a show and tell and had decided Gerald was appropriately representative of her interests and personality, which Ethan thought was genuinely correct. She talked for most of the drive. Something about a disagreement with her friend Cora about whether dolphins were smarter than dogs. And her position was that the question was unfair because they lived in completely different environments, and you couldn't compare intelligences that had evolved for different problems, which was such a precise and reasonable argument that Ethan had to concentrate on not showing how much it floored him. That's a good point, he said. Cora doesn't think so. Cora might come around. She won't, Mia said, with the serene certainty of someone who knows their friend well. But that's okay. We still eat lunch together. He pulled up in front of the school. She grabbed her backpack, then she paused with one hand on the door and looked at him with the direct brown eyes that saw more than was comfortable. You're going to be home for dinner tonight? She said. I'm going to try. She looked at him for one more second, the specific look that meant she was deciding whether try was good enough. Then she got out and walked toward the school entrance without looking back, which was new. She used to wave from the door. He sat in the car watching until she was inside, then pulled back into traffic. He got to Hartwell Technologies at 8:50. Badged through the service entrance out of habit, realized he didn't need to anymore, and kept going anyway. Some habits were structural. Priya was at the console with 3 screens running. She looked up when he came in and said, I found the destination. He put his jacket over a chair and came to look. The data recorder in the 5th layer had been configured to route its collected payload through a nested relay. 3 hops through external server addresses, each one designed to look like routine system telemetry, the kind of traffic that appeared on network monitoring logs as background noise. The final destination was an external address that was registered to a shell company in Delaware called Meridian Analytical Services. Meridian Analytical Services, Ethan said. I ran the registration, Priya said. Shell company. Incorporated 4 years ago. No public-facing operations, no employees on record. The registered agent is a law firm in Wilmington that specializes in corporate formation for clients who prefer limited disclosure. 4 years ago, he said. 3 years before the Helios project formally began. She looked at him. Someone set up the extraction infrastructure before the project existed. He stood very still. The weight of that settled into the room like temperature change, slow, pervasive, impossible to ignore once you felt it. This wasn't reactive, he said. This wasn't someone inside the company who saw an opportunity and took it. This was built around the opportunity. The whole thing. Holt's position, the framework integration, the layered anomalies. This was the plan from the beginning. Priya nodded. She looked tired. The the particular tiredness of someone who has been running on competence and professionalism and has just hit the point where the human underneath it is showing through. "How far back does this go?" she said. "I don't know," Ethan said, "and I don't think we're going to be able to find out from inside this building." He pulled out his phone. "We need to go upstairs." He texted Yao, "Need Isabella, now, both of you." Yao's response came in 40 seconds. "Conference room 38B, 20 minutes." They went up. Isabella was already in the conference room when they arrived. Yao was standing near the window. Neither of them looked like they'd slept especially well. Isabella had a coffee cup that she was actually drinking from, which Ethan had not seen before. She'd had coffee in every meeting but hadn't touched it. Today, she was drinking it like she needed it. She looked at Ethan when he walked in. "Tell me you have something solid." "I have something that goes considerably further than solid," he said. He set the tablet on the table and walked her through it. The notation syntax, the defense contractor context, Meridian Analytical Services, the incorporation date, the relay architecture, the full picture of what the recorder had been built to do and where it had been built to send its collection. He laid it out in sequence, the way he'd laid everything out, factually and in order. When he finished, the conference room was very quiet. Isabella set her coffee down. She looked at the tablet for a long moment. Then she said, "He built the extraction architecture 3 years before Helios existed." "Yes." "Which means he came to this company with the infrastructure already in place." "Yes." "Which means he didn't find this opportunity," she said. "He created it. He built toward it from the moment he walked through the door." "That's what the evidence suggests." She was quiet again. Her hands were flat on the table. He could see her jaw working slightly. Not emotion, exactly, or not only emotion. Calculation. The specific kind of thinking that happens when a person who is very good at managing large, complex systems absorbs the information that one of the most important components of that system has been working against it from the start. 11 years, she said, to no one in particular. Yao said quietly, "Isabella." "I know," she said. She straightened. Something crystallized in her expression, not coldness but resolution, which was different. Colder in some ways and considerably more purposeful. "What's Holt's status? He's back tomorrow?" "Friday," Ethan said. "His return flight is early afternoon." "And Webb and Reese? The suspensions were announced yesterday." "Yes," Yao said. "Webb didn't come in. Webb didn't." "Reese came in, collected some personal items, left without incident. Legal has both of them." "Has anyone contacted Holt about the suspensions?" "I sent him a standard notification as Executive VP, Yao said. "Brief, scope to the project integrity investigation. No details about the audit findings." "Did he respond?" "Yes. Yesterday evening." Yao picked up his phone, read from it. He said, and I'm quoting, "Thanks for the heads up. Unfortunate situation. We'll discuss when I'm back Friday. Keep me in the loop." Yao set the phone down. He sounded completely unbothered. "Because he thinks the loop doesn't include the third piece," Ethan said. "Or he's very good," Priya said. Isabella looked at her. "He's very good," she said, with the flatness of direct knowledge. "He's been very good for 11 years. That's the problem." She looked at Ethan. "What do you need to make the Holt attribution conclusive, not circumstantial? Conclusive." "The Meridian registration documentation," Ethan said. "If there's a beneficial owner behind the Delaware shell that connects to Holt personally, that closes it. A law firm in Wilmington created it, but someone instructed that law firm. There's a paper trail. Getting to it is outside my technical scope. It requires legal authority and probably federal involvement given the nature of what the recorder was collecting." She nodded slowly. "Federal involvement." She said it like she was measuring the weight of the phrase. "You're telling me we need to bring this to the government?" "To the people managing the contract, yes. What's in that recorder is federal data. The exposure belongs to them as much as it belongs to you. And frankly," he paused, making sure he wanted to say this, "going to them first, voluntarily, with full documentation and a clean system is significantly better than having this surface another way." She looked at him. You mean if Holt realizes the plan is fully compromised and goes to them himself with a different version of the story? Yes, he would do that, she said. Not with bitterness, with knowledge. The specific, tired knowledge of someone who has just finished recalibrating their understanding of a person they trusted. She stood up and walked to the window. The harbor was gray and choppy, a November wind cutting across it. She stood with her arms slightly crossed, not defensively, just holding herself together at the normal human cost of decisions that don't have good options. If I go to the Federal Review team before Holt gets back, she said, I lose the element of... You don't have an element of surprise, Ethan said carefully. He knows the plan failed. He's had 3 days. The question isn't whether he knows, it's whether he's already moving. She turned around. Is he? I don't know. I've been looking at the system. I haven't been looking at him. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at Yao. Get me the Federal Review coordinator. Today. She looked at Ethan. I want you in that conversation. Okay. And I want the full audit documentation. Every anomaly, every access log, the meridian connection, the notation analysis. Packaged cleanly enough that someone without your technical background can follow it. She paused. Can Priya do that? Priya said, I can have it ready in 4 hours. 3, Isabella said. Not unkindly, just precisely. 3, Priya agreed. The federal coordinator's name was Agent Sandra Kwan. She was the lead on the government contract review team, a compact woman in her mid-40s with the specific bearing of someone who had spent a career being handed situations that were more complicated than advertised and had developed a personal policy about not showing surprise. She arrived at the 39th floor at 2:15 with a colleague who didn't introduce himself and a briefcase that she set on the table without opening. She shook Isabella's hand, then she looked at Ethan with the particular attention of someone whose job involves assessing people quickly and who has just encountered a variable that doesn't fit the expected pattern. You're the maintenance technician, she said. Systems auditor for the duration of this review, Isabella said smoothly before Ethan could respond. It was the first time he'd heard her describe him that way. He noted it without comment. Kwan said. She sat down. Show me what you have. They showed her. Priya's documentation package was precise and complete and structured for a non-specialist reader without talking down to a specialist one, which was a difficult balance and she'd managed it. Kwan went through it with the methodical focus of someone reading a document she intended to have an opinion about rather than a reaction to. The colleague took notes. When she finished, she closed the package and looked at Isabella. You're reporting this voluntarily and proactively. Yes, Isabella said, before the scheduled review, which is in 6 days. Yes. And the Helios system is currently clean and operational. Confirmed, Ethan said. The trigger and the door have been routed around and isolated. The recorder is still in the partition block but has been disconnected from its relay architecture. Nothing has been extracted. Kwan looked at him for a long moment. You're certain nothing was extracted? The back door was never activated. The emergency restart that would have created the activation window didn't occur. He met her gaze. I stopped the restart. She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at the documentation. The meridian connection. You believe this leads to David Holt? The technical evidence is circumstantial but substantial, Ethan said. The legal documentation behind the meridian registration is outside my reach. You have the authority to access it. We do, she said. She looked at her colleague. Something passed between them. Mr. Holt is returning Friday. Correct. She closed her briefcase. We'll need full system access for our own technical team beginning tomorrow, and we'll need Mr. Cole available for consultation through the duration of our review. You have both, Isabella said. Ms. Hartwell. Kwan looked at her directly. Reporting this voluntarily and bringing it to us in this condition, documented, contained, system intact, that matters. I want you to know that's being noted. Isabella nodded. She didn't perform gratitude. She just accepted the statement as information. Kwan and her colleague left at 3:40. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet after significant things have happened in them. Yao exhaled. It was the most unguarded sound Ethan had heard from him. That went better than it could have, he said. It's not done, Isabella said. She was still looking at the door Quan had walked out of. Holt comes back tomorrow. He's going to walk into a building where two of his collaborators are suspended. Federal agents have access to the system, and nobody's told him any of it directly. That's the point, Ethan said. I know it's the point. She turned. I'm going to have to look at him. Have a conversation. Act normal. She said it flatly, without self-pity, but with the acknowledgement that it was a real thing she was going to have to do. 11 years. Ethan said nothing. There wasn't anything useful to say to that. She looked at him. How do you do it? She said. The separation between what you know and what you show. He thought about it honestly. You get used to it, he said, and then eventually you get tired of it. And then you find something that matters more than the work, and you let the work go. She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her expression shifted. Not vulnerability exactly, but the adjacent thing. The small gap between the controlled surface and the actual person underneath it, briefly visible. What if you can't let it go? Then you do it until it's done, he said, and you go home. She was quiet. Then she nodded once, to herself more than to him, and picked up her phone and began the next set of calls. He left the building at 5:15. It was already full dark, the Boston streets lit orange and cold, the traffic doing its early evening thing. He sat in the Civic in the parking lot for 2 minutes before starting it, not doing anything, just breathing. Then he drove to the grocery store, bought the ingredients for the pasta thing Mia liked, the one with the butter and the parmesan and nothing that could be described as a vegetable, which he'd stopped arguing about on a cost-benefit basis, and drove home. Mia was at the kitchen table doing homework when he came in. Jade was on the couch reading, and she gathered her things and said goodbye with the easy familiarity of someone who had become quietly essential to the architecture of this household without anyone formally deciding it. You're home for dinner, Mia said, not looking up from her worksheet. I said I'd try. You did try. She turned a page. That's the pasta stuff? Yeah. Good. She went back to the worksheet. He made dinner, she ate, he ate. The kitchen was warm and the radiator was doing its ticking thing, and at some point during the meal she told him that Gerald had been a hit at show and tell and that Cora had admitted, under social pressure, that the dolphin versus dog debate was more complicated than she'd initially presented it, which Mia considered a partial victory and was prepared to accept. After dinner, she went upstairs to finish her homework, and he washed the dishes and stood at the kitchen sink looking at the dark window above it and thought about David Holt getting off a plane from Washington tomorrow afternoon and walking into a building where everything had changed and nothing looked different yet. He thought about the documentation package and Agent Kwan's briefcase and Isabella saying 11 years in the way people say things they're going to be sitting with for a long time. He thought about the notation syntax in the framework documentation, the compressed specific shorthand of a world he'd left, showing up in the code architecture of a company's flagship project like a signature someone hadn't thought anyone would recognize. He thought about Priya, who had been at the console when he left, running one final verification pass on the data recorder's relay disconnection, doing the work with the quiet thoroughness of someone who had stopped being surprised by what they were finding and was simply committed to finding all of it. He dried his hands, put the dishes away. Mia called from upstairs. Dad? Yeah. Can you check my math? He went upstairs, sat on the edge of her bed, looked at the worksheet, long division, the kind that required showing your work in a specific format that the school had mandated and that bore very little resemblance to how any actual human being did arithmetic. He went through it with her, problem by problem, pointing out one error in the third question where she'd carried the wrong digit. Ugh, she said. It's one problem. It's annoying. Yeah, he said. Math is annoying sometimes. She fixed it, looked at it. Is it right now? He checked. Yes. Okay. She closed the worksheet and looked at him. Are you going to be at the school thing on the 14th? The parent lunch. Yes. You promise? He looked at her. The direct brown eyes, the complete seriousness of it. 7 years old and already she knew that the difference between I'll try and I promise was a real difference. I promise, he said. She nodded. filed it in the place where she kept promises. Then she lay back against her pillow and said, "Is work going to be like this for a while?" "Probably a little longer," he said. "Not much." "Okay," she yawned. Gerald the elephant was already under her chin. "It's okay if it is. I know it's important." He looked at her for a moment. She was already most of the way to sleep, the way children can be, completely present one moment and then almost gone. He didn't ask her how she knew it was important, because she was 7 and she wouldn't have been able to explain it in words, and it wouldn't have mattered. She just knew. The way she knew things, through some combination of watching and listening and the specific intelligence of a child who had lost one parent and paid very close attention to the one she had left. He tucked the blanket up. "Sleep," he said. She was already there. In the hallway, he straightened the photograph. Then he went back downstairs, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table with the secure tablet, because there were 3 things in the Helios architecture he wanted to double-check before tomorrow, and being home for dinner didn't mean the work was done. It just meant he'd done the most important thing first. He worked until 11. At 11, he closed the tablet and turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark house for a moment. The radiator ticking, the refrigerator humming, the particular sound of a life that was genuinely his, in all its imperfect and non-negotiable realness. Then he went to bed. His alarm was set for 5:30. David Holt's flight landed at 2:47 in the afternoon. Ethan knew because Yao texted him at 3:04. "He's in the building." And then, 4 minutes later, Isabella's office. He was in the Level B control center with Priya and 2 members of Agent Kwan's technical team when the texts came through. He read them both, set the phone face down on the console, and went back to the cross-verification he'd been running. Priya glanced at him. He said nothing. She went back to her screen. 22 minutes later, his phone rang. Isabella. He stepped out of the control center into the corridor. "Yes." Her voice was level and controlled, and underneath the control there was something that was not quite any specific emotion, but was the product of a conversation she'd just had that had cost her something. "He knows," she said. "Not everything, but enough. When I told him about the federal team's involvement, A pause. He didn't react the way an innocent person reacts. What did he do? He asked very specific questions about the scope of the audit, about what exactly had been found, about whether the system logs from the initial development phase were part of the review. She paused. He asked about you. About me. He asked who had conducted the technical audit. When I said it was our maintenance team, I didn't give your name. I said maintenance team. He was quiet for a moment, and then he asked what level of architectural access they'd had. Ethan stood in the corridor. The overhead lights were on their day setting, fully bright. Somewhere above him, on the 39th floor, David Holt was in a room doing the math on how much had been found and what his options were. He's going to move tonight, Ethan said. Or he's going to try. I know. A pause. Agent Kwan is already aware. She was listening. He processed that. You had him walk into a monitored conversation. I had a meeting with my executive VP about a project crisis, she said carefully. Agent Kwan and her team had full access to my office systems as part of the technical review. Whatever was captured in that meeting was incidental. It was a precise and deliberate statement. He understood what it meant and what it didn't mean. Okay, he said. Stay in the building tonight, she said. Both of you. I'll make sure there's food. She ended the call. He went back into the control center. Priya looked up. The 2 federal technicians kept working. Holt's in the building, he said. She nodded. I know. She looked at the screen. I've been watching the external relay architecture. The one connected to the Meridian routing. She paused. Someone attempted a connection to the relay from inside the building's network 15 minutes ago. Did it go through? No, we disconnected the recorder's relay architecture 2 days ago. Whoever tried it hit a dead end. She looked at him. But the attempt is logged. The originating IP address is on the executive network. He sat down, looked at the screen. That's not circumstantial, he said. No, she said. It's not. He picked up his phone and called Yao. Yao answered in one ring. I see it, Yao said, before Ethan could speak. I've been watching the executive network logs. I'm sending it to Quan now. He's still in the building. I know. A pause. Cole. Yao's voice had a specific quality, not panic, but the sound of someone who is fully aware of how many things are moving at once. This ends tonight, one way or another. Yes, Ethan said. He set the phone down. Priya was still looking at the screen. At the logged connection attempt, the dead relay, the executive network IP sitting there in the data like a name written in someone's own handwriting on a document they'd claimed they'd never touched. What happens now? She said. Now we wait, Ethan said, and we make sure we have everything documented. And then? He looked at the Helios console. The system running clean and stable and green across every monitor, the cascade trigger isolated, the backdoor sealed, the recorder disconnected, the whole architecture finally doing what it had been designed to do without anything hidden inside it, working toward a different purpose. Then it's not our job anymore, he said. He thought about Mia asleep with Gerald the elephant, about a parent lunch on the 14th, about a promise, which was a different thing from trying. He pulled up the documentation archive and started writing the final audit summary. Precise, complete, every finding in sequence, every piece of evidence referenced and dated. The kind of document that left nothing to interpretation. He had always been good at documentation. He worked, and the building hummed around him, and somewhere above him things were moving toward their conclusion. David Holt was escorted out of Hartwell Technologies at 8:43 in the evening by 2 federal agents and a company security officer who had the uncomfortable expression of someone performing a task they'd never expected to perform in this building. Ethan didn't see it happen. He was in the Level B control center, finalizing the audit documentation, when Yao texted him 2 words. It's done. He read the text, set the phone down, and kept writing. There was nothing to see anyway. The significant part of what had happened to David Holt had occurred in the preceding 72 hours, in lines of code and access logs and a shell company registration in Delaware. And the physical fact of him leaving the building was just the last page of a document that had already been written. Priya, who had been running verification checks on the relay disconnection for the 3rd time, looked over when Ethan set the phone down. She read his expression, said nothing, went back to her screen. They worked for another hour. When they were done, the Helios system was the cleanest it had ever been. Not just stable, not just recovered, but genuinely clean in the way that something is clean when every layer of it has been examined by someone who knew what they were looking for. Ethan had written the final audit summary with the same flat precision he wrote everything, but it was longer than any other document he'd produced in his 14 months at Hartwell Technologies. And it was the most complete technical record he'd assembled since the years he didn't talk about. He printed 2 copies, gave one to Priya, kept one. She held hers for a moment and then looked at him with the expression of someone who has been through something significant with another person and is working out what that means going forward. What happens to Helios now? She said. The federal team does their own verification pass, he said. Probably takes a week. If they clear it, the review timeline gets reset. Not 9 days, but not 18 months either. A few weeks probably. Then the project continues. With different people running it. With different people running it, he agreed. She nodded slowly. And Webb and Reese? That's for legal. And federal probably, given what they were part of. He paused. Reese, I think, was a follower. He made a bad calculation about who to align with. Webb, he considered it. Webb understood more than he should have. He'll answer for that. She was quiet for a moment. Do you think Holt will talk? Tell them who else was involved? Whether this goes somewhere beyond him? He'll have reasons to, Ethan said. Whether he does is a question for people who negotiate those kinds of conversations. She nodded again. She seemed to want to say something else and was deciding whether to. Then, for what it's worth, working with you this week was the most technically demanding thing I've done in my career. And the most, she paused, looking for the right word, the most honest, if that makes sense. Most technical work has a layer of performance in it, people showing each other how much they know. You don't do that. He thought about how to respond. He wasn't built for this kind of conversation. Never had been. Probably never would be. You're good at this, he said. The work. The way you follow a thread without needing to know where it ends. She looked slightly surprised, which told him she hadn't expected him to say something back. "Thank you," she said. And then she packed up her tablet and her printed copy of the documentation and left. He sat alone in the Level B control center for a few minutes. The Helios monitors were all green. The system hummed. The room had the specific quality of a space where a crisis had lived for several days and then departed, leaving the ordinary behind. He turned off the console lights he'd been using, left the monitoring systems running, and went home. The streetlight in front of the house was still out. He'd submitted the maintenance request to the city 3 weeks ago. He'd probably submit it again next week. Mia was asleep. He checked on her. Door an inch open, Gerald present, the blanket where it was supposed to be. Then he went back downstairs and sat at the kitchen table and didn't open the tablet, didn't look at anything work-related, just sat with a cup of tea and let the quiet of the house be quiet. He thought about David Holt, not with anger. Anger would have required a more personal investment than he actually felt, more with the specific tiredness that comes from recognizing that the kind of person who could spend 11 years building toward a betrayal of the people who trusted him was not especially rare. That people with real technical brilliance and real institutional knowledge sometimes use those things in the direction of pure self-interest so completely that it stopped looking like a moral failure and started looking like a design choice, a fundamental orientation toward the world. He thought about the 11 years Isabella had said, the way she'd said it. He thought about the fact that when the Helios emergency had happened, when the system was failing and every engineer in the building was looking at the wrong layer of the problem, the person who had actually understood what was happening had been crouched in a sub-level corridor checking a coolant pipe at 2 a.m, wearing a gray uniform, filling in maintenance logs that nobody read past the first line. He didn't think about that with bitterness. He thought about it as information, about how thoroughly the visible and the significant had separated from each other in the world he'd inhabited for 14 months, about how comfortable everyone in that building, himself included in his own way, had become with the distance between what something looked like and what it actually was. He drank his tea, washed the cup, went to bed. Friday was Mia's class picture. She came downstairs in the rain jacket. He looked at it. She looked at him looking at it. There was a beat of negotiation. Silent, 7 years old versus 32 years old, neither side with a particularly strong position. "It makes you feel like yourself," he said. "Yes," she said. "Okay," he said. She ate her toast. He made his coffee. The morning moved the way mornings moved, with its own momentum, its own requirements, its own very specific and irreducible demands. He walked her to the bus stop, and she got on the bus and he stood on the sidewalk and watched it pull away. And then he went inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment, just being in it, before he started his day. He didn't go to Hartwell Technologies that morning. He went to the hardware store and bought a specific kind of wall anchor he'd been meaning to get for 2 months, came home, and properly secured the frame of the upstairs hallway photograph so that it would actually stay straight instead of going crooked every 24 hours. It took 11 minutes. He stood back and looked at it, Sarah laughing, Mia's shoulder under her hand, him looking at the wrong thing, which had turned out to be the right thing. He went downstairs and ate a real breakfast, not toast or crackers or whatever was available in the vicinity of a work console at 7 p.m. Eggs again, the good kind, with the yolk still running. His phone rang at 10:15. "Isabella." He answered. "The federal team cleared their preliminary inspection this morning," she said. "The system documentation you produced. Quan called it the most thorough voluntary audit disclosure she'd received in 11 years of contract reviews. She said that specifically. I thought you should know." "Okay," he said. A beat of silence. "The board meeting is Monday," she said. "Formal removal of Webb, Reese, and Holt pending investigation outcomes. There will be an announcement, internal first, then public. I'll be transparent about what happened and what we found." She paused. "It's going to be a difficult month." "Probably," he said. "The stock will take a hit," she said. Not complaining, just stating. "My reputation in certain rooms is going to take a hit. People I've done business with for years are going to ask questions about how this happened inside a company I run." Another pause. "I've been thinking about that." "And?" And I've decided I'm less interested in managing how it looks than in making sure the way we handle it is something I can actually defend. She said it like she'd arrived at it recently and was still checking whether it held weight. That's new for me, putting it that way. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything he needed to say. There's something I want to ask you, she said. Okay. Not today. Next week, after the board meeting. I want to have a different kind of conversation about your role here, going forward, what it could look like. She paused. I'm not going to pressure you. I just want to have the conversation. All right, he said. All right, she said back. And then, in the slightly awkward way of someone who doesn't often close conversations without having fully controlled their terms, have a good weekend, Ethan. It was the first time she'd used his first name. He noticed it. You too, he said. He spent the afternoon doing the things that didn't get done when work consumed the week. Laundry, the grocery run he actually completed this time. A call to his sister in Portland, who he talked to infrequently and guiltily, and who spent most of the conversation talking about her kids and her house renovation, and only asked about him once, in the specific way of someone who has learned not to push but wants to leave the door open. He told her things were okay. She said she was glad. He meant it, and she heard that he meant it, and that was enough. Mia came home at 3:15 with the picture from school. They'd given the kids a preview print, one of those small ones meant to be sent home as proof before the actual orders were placed. She handed it to him without preamble and watched his face. It was a good picture. She was sitting in the second row, slightly to the left of center, looking directly at the camera with the composure of someone who had decided to cooperate with the photographer on her own terms. The rain jacket was a vivid green in the print. She looked like herself. It's a good one, he said. I know, she said, and went to put her backpack away. He looked at the photograph for a moment longer. 7 years old in a rain jacket, looking at the camera like she'd made a decision about it. He put it on the refrigerator, next to the drawings she'd been accumulating there since September, and it looked like it had always been in exactly that spot. The following Monday, Isabella Hartwell stood in front of her board and told them what had happened inside their company. Not a managed version. Not a strategically scoped presentation designed to minimize reputational damage while technically covering the required disclosure. The whole thing, in sequence, with the same documentation Ethan had assembled, laid out in front of the people who had put their names and money behind her company and deserved to know what had been growing in its walls. She removed Webb, Reese, and Holt. Formally, with cause, with the federal investigation's involvement noted and the legal process explicitly referenced. She did not soften it, and she did not blame the institution rather than the individuals. She named them, and she named what they had done, and she accepted, in front of the room, that it had happened in a company she ran and that the oversight failures that had allowed it were in part her responsibility. It was, by any measure, a brutal meeting. Ethan wasn't there. He knew about it because Yao called him afterward, sounding like a man who had been through several hours of very concentrated difficulty and was processing it in real time. She didn't hedge, Yao said. I've worked with her for 7 years and I've watched her handle hard situations very well, and I've never seen her do anything like that. Just straight. How did the board respond? Ethan asked. Mixed, Yao said honestly. Some of them are worried about liability exposure. Some of them are worried about the press. 2 of the older members, he paused. 2 of them said they respected it, that it was the right call. Another pause. I think more of them think that than said it. That's usually how it goes, Ethan said. Yeah. Yao was quiet for a moment. She's going to be okay. The company is going to be okay. I believe that. He stopped. It's going to be a hard few months. Most things worth doing are, Ethan said. A beat of quiet on the line. Then Yao said, the conversation Isabella wants to have with you, the one about your role going forward. He paused carefully. I want you to know that whatever you decide, what you did here, finding that code, preventing the restart, documenting all of it and taking it to the right people, that mattered, genuinely. Not as a corporate talking point. It mattered. I know it did, Ethan said. Not with pride. Just with the flat accuracy of someone who understood the stakes of what had been found and what would have happened if it hadn't been. He met with Isabella on Thursday of that week, not in the conference room on the 38th floor. She'd suggested her office, and he'd said he'd prefer somewhere neutral, and after a brief pause, she'd agreed and proposed the small meeting room on the 7th floor that the engineering teams used for working sessions. Functional furniture, a whiteboard that still had someone's system diagram on it from the week before. A window that looked onto the building's north side parking structure rather than the harbor. She was already there when he arrived. Coffee for both of them, which was a detail he noticed. She was wearing a dark gray jacket and looked, for the first time since he'd known her, slightly tired around the edges. Not depleted, but present in a way that the controlled, high-altitude version of her hadn't quite been. "Thank you for meeting with me," she said. "Sure," he said. He sat down. The coffee was good. It was always good on the executive floors, one of the more honest indicators of institutional priority. She had a folder in front of her. She didn't open it immediately. "I've been thinking about how to have this conversation," she said. "I've drafted it a few different ways." What was wrong with the drafts? They were too transactional. She looked at him directly. "What I want to say is that this company has a problem it's had for a long time, and I'm only now seeing it clearly. The problem is that we have been very good at valuing the visible things, titles, floors, the right kind of credentials displayed in the right kind of way, and very bad at seeing what was actually underneath them." She paused. "I looked at you in a server room and saw a maintenance technician. I said something in front of a room full of people that I would not have said if I'd known who you were." "You mean if you'd known my background?" Ethan said. "No," she said. She was precise about it. "I mean, if I'd been paying attention to what was actually in front of me. Your background is part of it. But what was actually in front of me was a person doing a job carefully and well, and I dismissed that because I'd already categorized it." She paused. "That's a failure of observation. It's also a failure of basic decency, and I want to say that directly." He looked at her. The 7th floor meeting room with its functional furniture and its leftover whiteboard diagram and its view of the parking structure. She was not performing this. He would have been able to tell. "I appreciate that," he said. "I'm not asking you to accept an apology," she said. "I'm stating a fact about my own behavior because I think it's important to be accurate about it." She opened the folder. "What I'm actually asking is whether you would consider a formal advisory role with this company. Technical architecture advisory, specifically the Helios project and the broader infrastructure systems. Flexible engagement, your schedule, and hours set by you, rate commensurate with the actual level of work. No full-time requirement, no office you're expected to inhabit." He looked at the folder. The document inside it was clean and relatively short, which told him she had deliberately resisted the institutional tendency to make offers look bigger by making them more complex. "What does advisory mean specifically?" he said. "It means we call you when there's something we can't see clearly," she said. "It means you tell us when we're making the wrong diagnosis. It means you have standing to push back on technical decisions at any level, including mine." She paused. "It does not mean you attend board meetings. It does not mean you manage anyone. It does not mean you are available at 2 a.m. unless you choose to be." He was quiet for a moment. "My daughter has a parent lunch on the 14th, he said. She looked slightly surprised. Then her expression settled into something that was almost a smile. Not quite, but the shape of it. "Then you'll be there," she said. "And I'll continue the night maintenance work," he said. "Part of it. The building's infrastructure still needs what it needs. I'd want to keep some oversight there." She looked at him for a moment, like she was deciding whether that was a negotiating position or a real preference. It was a real preference, and apparently she could tell, because she nodded without making anything of it. "Fine," she said. "Whatever configuration works." He looked at the document again. At the practical reality of what it represented, a return, partial and structured and on his own terms, to the kind of technical work he'd spent 2 years telling himself he'd left behind. He thought about whether he'd actually left it behind or whether he'd just put it down somewhere he could find it again when it was needed. Whether those were the same thing. "Give me the weekend," he said. "Take it," she said. He drove home. The Civic's heater was working. The streetlight in front of the house was still out. He'd submitted the request 4 times now. He'd probably submit it again. Mia was at the kitchen table when he came in. Homework, the same ritual, the same tableau. And she looked up when the door opened and said, "Normal time today." "Normal time," he agreed. "Good." She looked back at her homework. "Jade says I can learn to play chess if I want. She says it's good for your brain." "It is," he said, hanging up his jacket. "Did you learn?" He thought about the places where he'd learned, the specific institutional settings, the long evenings, the people across the board who were in many cases nothing like chess enthusiasts and everything like people who needed something to do with their minds during the intervals between difficult things. "Yeah," he said. "I learned. Will you teach me?" "Sure," he said. She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her worksheet. He made dinner, she ate, he ate. The radiator ticked. She told him that Cora had brought in a library book about dolphins to prove her point, and that the book was actually more complicated than Cora had expected, and had partially supported Mia's original argument, which Mia was being gracious about, mostly. After dinner, she went upstairs and he washed the dishes and stood at the kitchen window, the same window, looking at the dark outside it. Mrs. Papadopoulos's relocated rosebush had survived the first hard frost, which was more resilience than anyone had expected from it. The Garcia dog was barking at something across the street. A cloud, probably, or the specific quality of the dark it had decided to object to. He thought about the advisory folder sitting on the passenger seat of the Civic. The short, clean document with its flexible terms and its implicit acknowledgement that some things have value that doesn't depend on where they're done or what they're called. He thought about the server room 4 weeks ago. The relay component in his hand, scorched at one contact point. The room full of people who had learned to laugh at the right moments. Her voice carrying clearly across the space. Someone who knows nothing about what actually runs this building. And then 31 minutes in a control room and the boards going green in sequence, and a silence so complete you could hear the ventilation system. He didn't think about that with satisfaction. He thought about it as the story of how things actually are, underneath the stories people tell about how things are. The maintenance technician who was actually a systems architect. The trusted executive who was actually an extraction mechanism. The CEO who was actually underneath the controlled altitude and the clipped voice and the 11 years of building something. A person who could sit in a chair by a window and say 11 years and mean it. Nobody was what they first appeared to be. That wasn't a revelation. That was just the ordinary truth of human beings, which most institutions spent considerable energy pretending wasn't the case. He dried his hands, turned off the kitchen light, went upstairs. The photograph in the hallway was straight. It had stayed straight all week since he'd fixed the anchor properly. He stood in front of it for a moment, Sarah laughing at something off camera, Mia's small shoulder under her hand, him looking at the wrong direction and getting it exactly right. He thought about what it meant to build something worth keeping, not to design it perfectly. Nothing was ever designed perfectly, but to know what it was made of, to find the things hiding inside it that didn't belong. To do the work of making it honest even when that work was invisible, even when nobody in the room fully understood what was happening, even when the people responsible for seeing it hadn't yet learned how. He thought about Mia's question, months ago now. "Are you going to be okay?" He was. Not in the way that meant everything was resolved and all the hard things were over. In the way that meant he knew where he was standing and why, and what was worth his time and what wasn't, and the difference between those two things was something he'd stopped pretending he couldn't see. On Monday morning, he called Isabella's office and told Claire he was accepting the advisory role. Claire said she'd let Ms. Hartwell know and send over the paperwork. She sounded genuinely pleased, which was a small thing that he noticed anyway. He went back to his kitchen table and opened his maintenance log, the physical one, the actual battered notebook he carried in his jacket pocket, and wrote down the things that needed checking on the next shift. The HVAC seal on 6C, a pressure reading on the sublevel coolant line he'd been monitoring since October. The relay switch in the third-floor server room that he'd want to check again in another 30 days. The work that nobody saw, which was the work that kept everything running. He wrote it all down in the same flat, precise shorthand he'd always used. Not because anyone required him to, not because there was a performance attached to it, but because it was accurate, and accuracy was the only thing he'd ever actually trusted. Outside, the November had turned into December without much ceremony. The first real cold had come in. Mrs. Papadopoulos's rosebush had lost its leaves and was doing whatever dormant things rosebushes do in winter, which he suspected involved more survival instinct than was obvious from the outside. The streetlight in front of the house came on that evening for the first time in weeks. He didn't know if the city had finally addressed his request, or if it had fixed itself, or if it was a coincidence. It didn't matter. The light was there, and it lit the small stretch of sidewalk in front of the house the way it was supposed to, and the neighborhood looked like itself again in the most ordinary way. Mia noticed it when she came home from school. She stood on the front step for a moment, looking at it like it was a minor event worth acknowledging. Then she came inside and said, "The light's working." "Yeah," he said. She hung up her backpack. She looked at him. "Did you fix it?" He thought about it. The 4 work orders, the city maintenance system, the specific question of whether persistence and documentation and following the right process eventually produced results, or whether things just sometimes fix themselves on their own timeline, regardless. "I made a lot of phone calls," he said. She considered that. "That's basically fixing it," she said. "More or less," he said. She went to the kitchen table. He put the kettle on. The house was warm and the light outside was working, and his daughter was doing her homework at the table with the same focused expression she'd inherited from her mother, who had been the kind of person who gave everything her full attention while it was in front of her, without reservation, which was a way of being in the world that turned out to be both a gift and an instruction. He had a parent lunch on the 14th. He had a maintenance log with 3 items on it for tomorrow's shift. He had an advisory folder signed and submitted, and a technical role that asked him to see clearly and say what he saw and not perform anything in either direction. He had a photograph in the upstairs hallway that finally stayed straight. He had a 7-year-old in a green rain jacket who argued about dolphin cognition with complete intellectual rigor and ate at burned toast by preference, and had the kind of direct brown eyes that looked at you like you were worth looking at, which was not a small thing. In fact, it was the largest thing. It had always been the largest thing. He poured the water over the tea, set the cup on the table, sat down across from Mia while she finished her worksheet. She didn't look up, but after a moment she said, the way she sometimes said things that came from somewhere he couldn't fully track, "It's better when you're here." He looked at the steam rising from the cup, at the refrigerator with the class picture and the drawings, at the kitchen window and the dark outside it, and the small yellow light from the street lamp falling on the sidewalk through the glass. "Yeah," he said. "It is." He stayed there. That was all. He stayed.